What if the worst disaster in American military history was actually the single greatest gift the United States ever received? Because 8 men burned to death in an Iranian desert on a night that was supposed to save 52 American hostages, and that catastrophic failure built the deadliest fighting force the world has ever seen. If you find stories like this fascinating, where catastrophic failure transforms into unstoppable power, take 1 second to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who loves military history. It helps more than you know, and I promise you this story is worth every second of your time. On November 4th, 1979, everything changed in the Middle East. The Shah of Iran, a man who had been America's closest ally in that region for 3 decades, was overthrown. A religious revolution swept through the country, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, and overnight, one of America's most powerful partners became one of its most dangerous enemies. The Shah, who was dying of cancer at the time, asked the United States for permission to enter the country for medical treatment. President Jimmy Carter said yes. He honored a 30-year alliance. 13 days later, approximately 3,000 Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. The Marine Guards stationed there held their fire. Embassy security rules were clear. You do not use lethal force unless lives are in immediate danger. The rules existed specifically to prevent a diplomatic crisis from spiraling into a war. 66 American citizens were taken hostage. Here is something most people do not know. The students who carried out the takeover later admitted that the original plan was a symbolic sit-in lasting just 48 hours. Hand over the Shah, and everyone goes home. But Carter refused. The Shah was a dying man. Turning him over would have been a death sentence and a betrayal of everything the alliance stood for. Iran pushed harder. The crisis that was supposed to last 3 days stretched into a 444-day nightmare that played out on every television screen in America, every single night. ABC launched a program called America Held Hostage. It counted the days. That show eventually became Nightline and ran for 25 years. That is how massive this story was. It consumed the entire nation. After 5 months of failed negotiations, diplomatic back channels that went nowhere, and a country watching its dignity dissolve on live television, Carter gathered his top military advisors in the White House. He looked at them and said 5 words that would change the course of military history forever. He said, "All right, let's go get them." What Carter did not understand, what nobody in that room fully grasped, was that the United States military in 1980 was completely incapable of pulling off what he was asking for. And I do not say that as an insult. I say it as a fact, because every single person involved in what happened next would eventually admit the same thing. The American military in 1980 was not one force. It was 4 separate organizations pretending to work together. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines operated like 4 rival companies sharing the same building. They used different radios that could not communicate with each other. They operated on incompatible frequencies with incompatible encryption. They had different chains of command. They had different tactical doctrines. They had different definitions for basic operational terms. They even had different criteria for when to abort the same type of mission. They trained separately. They planned separately. They competed openly against each other for the same Pentagon budget dollars. There was no joint special operations command. There was no unified doctrine for how these 4 branches were supposed to function together on a single, complex, high-stakes mission. The Air Force was quietly trying to get rid of its special operations aircraft because it did not think they were worth the money. The Navy looked at the Marines and saw glorified security guards. The Army thought everyone else was irrelevant. And sitting at the center of this dysfunction was a brand new unit called Delta Force. It had been operational for exactly 5 months. Delta Force was the brainchild of one man, Colonel Charles Beckwith. He was a Vietnam veteran who had spent a year embedded with Britain's Special Air Service, the SAS, and he came home convinced that America needed its own version. A tiny, hand-picked, surgically precise counterterrorism unit capable of deploying anywhere on Earth with almost no warning. For over a decade, the Pentagon said no. Senior officers thought the SAS model was a foreign novelty. Regular Rangers and Green Berets could handle anything that came up. Beckwith fought for it anyway. He wrote papers, gave briefings, testified before Congress. Finally, in November 1977, he got the green light. The 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta was born. 5 months later, Carter came looking for them. These men had never run a single real-world operation, not one. And their very first mission in front of the entire watching world was going to be the most complex hostage rescue in modern military history. The plan they came up with was called Operation Eagle Claw. It was ambitious to the point of being reckless. 8 RH-53D Stallion helicopters would launch from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea. They would fly 600 miles at low altitude into the heart of Iran and land at a remote salt flat in the middle of the desert called Desert 1. 6 C-130 transport planes would arrive from the island of Masira, carrying Delta operators, Army Rangers, fuel, and equipment. The helicopters would refuel, load the assault teams, and fly another 50 miles to a mountain hideout where everyone would spend the entire next day hidden. On the second night, CIA assets already inside Tehran would drive trucks to the hideout, transport the operators into the city, and at midnight, Delta would simultaneously assault the embassy and 6 other buildings where hostages might be held. AC-130 gunships would provide air support. Rangers would seize a nearby airfield. Helicopters would extract everyone to that airfield. C-141 Starlifters would fly them all home. It required at least 6 functional helicopters. Fewer than 6, and the mission would be automatically canceled. That number, 6, would become the most consequential threshold in American military history. On April 24, 1980, the operation began. And almost immediately, it started falling apart. One helicopter developed a cracked rotor blade, warning, and had to be abandoned in the desert. 7 left. Then those 7 flew straight into a haboob. That is an Arabic word for a sandstorm the size of a city. Not a dust cloud, not a minor weather event. A wall of sand 1,000 feet tall and 50 miles wide, rolling across the desert like a living thing, eliminating all visibility, clogging avionics, cooling vents, separating aircraft that were supposed to be flying in formation, and turning every instrument panel into an unreliable guess. The pilots had been briefed on the possibility of dust. Nobody briefed them on a biblical sandstorm. One helicopter, convinced its instruments were failing because the haboob was destroying its cooling systems, turned around and flew all the way back to the Nimitz. 6 helicopters limped into Desert 1, 90 minutes behind schedule. The C-130s were already waiting. Refueling started. For one brief moment, it looked like the mission might still be salvageable. Then, the 6th surviving helicopter developed a hydraulic failure in its second-stage flight control system. It could not be repaired in the field. 5 helicopters, one below the minimum threshold. The mission was aborted. Now, this should have been the worst part of the night. It was not. Because whoever planned this operation somehow forgot to account for the fact that Desert 1 was sitting next to a public road. A civilian Iranian bus carrying 45 passengers came down that road and drove straight into a scene of C-130s and helicopters, sitting wide open in the desert. Rangers stopped the bus. Then a fuel tanker appeared. The driver was running a black market gasoline operation in post-revolution Iran, where fuel was strictly rationed. He hit the accelerator and tried to blow through the roadblock. A Delta intelligence officer ordered his man to stop the truck with an anti-tank weapon. The light anti-tank rocket hit the tanker dead center. The truck exploded in a fireball visible for miles. The driver survived by jumping out just before the blast, climbed into a pickup truck following behind, and vanished into the desert darkness. Suddenly, America had a dead Iranian civilian, 2 escaped eyewitnesses heading toward civilization, 45 bus passengers locked in the cargo bay of a C-130, a salt flat lit up like a bonfire, and an abort order from Washington telling everyone to evacuate before the Iranian military arrived. During the extraction, Marine Major Jim Schaefer needed to hover taxi his helicopter, Bluebeard 3, out of the path of a C-130 parked behind it. When he lifted into the hover, the rotor wash created a brownout so thick he could see absolutely nothing outside the cockpit. His only visual reference was an Air Force controller standing in front of the helicopter, signaling directions with his hands. The rotor wash blasted the controller backward. Schaefer saw the man appear to move away from the helicopter and interpreted that as his aircraft drifting backward. He pushed the stick forward to compensate. The controller kept staggering back into the wind. Schaefer kept correcting forward. Bluebeard 3's main rotor blade clipped the vertical stabilizer of the C-130 directly behind it. The helicopter pitched forward and crashed into the C-130's wing. That aircraft was carrying collapsible rubber fuel bladders filled with thousands of gallons of helicopter fuel, stacked on top of its own full internal fuel tanks. Both aircraft became a single fireball instantly. 5 Air Force airmen and 3 Marines were killed. The explosion shook every other aircraft parked nearby, and then the ammunition inside the burning C-130 started cooking off. Anti-aircraft missiles, grenades, rockets, thousands of rounds of small arms ammunition detonating in every direction. Tracer rounds shot out of the fireball like sparks from a furnace. A Stinger missile launched itself out of the burning fuselage and disappeared into the dark sky. Everyone still standing ran for the surviving C-130s. They left behind 5 fully intact helicopters, 8 Americans who could not be recovered from the flames, classified mission documents, photographs of the Tehran embassy compound, and the names of CIA assets operating undercover inside Iran. Carter went on national television the next morning and told the American people everything. The hostages were scattered across Iran within hours, moved into small groups, so that any future rescue attempt became mathematically impossible. The classified documents recovered from the abandoned helicopters were exploited by Iranian intelligence for years. The CIA asset names were eventually published, ending careers and endangering lives. Khomeini gave a speech declaring that God himself had sent angels in the form of the sandstorm. The Soviet Union spent weeks celebrating the humiliation on every diplomatic channel it could find. America's enemies looked at what happened and reached a single conclusion. The world's largest military power did not know how to conduct a complex special operation. They were absolutely right. And that was the last time they would ever be right about it. Before I tell you what came next, I want to ask you something. Are you someone who loves deep dives into moments that change the world? Because that is exactly what this channel is about. If this story has you locked in, consider hitting that subscribe button right now. I drop videos like this every week, and I do not want you to miss what is coming. Also, drop a comment below and tell me, did you know about Operation Eagle Claw before watching this? I'm genuinely curious. The Pentagon did not cover this up. They did not make excuses. They commissioned an independent investigation led by retired Admiral James Holloway III. Holloway was the perfect choice. 30 years of combat experience. No political career left to protect. No service loyalty left to defend. 4 months later, the Holloway report landed on desks across Washington, and it was brutal. 23 specific problems were identified. 11 of them were flagged as major contributors to the disaster: the incompatible radios, the separate chains of command, the different abort criteria, the Marine helicopter pilots who had been borrowed from fleet mine countermeasure squadrons and had zero experience flying long-range, low-altitude missions through desert terrain, the ad hoc joint task force that had been assembled from scratch with no institutional memory, no permanent staff, and no mandate that would survive past this single operation. Holloway's conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. He wrote that the enemy did not beat America in that desert. America beat itself. And then he laid out the roadmap for making sure it would never happen again. What followed was the most consequential restructuring of American military power in the 20th century. In December 1980, just 8 months after the disaster, the Joint Special Operations Command, known as JSOC, was established at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Every Tier 1 Special Operations unit in every branch of the military would now train together, live together, and operate as a single integrated force. No more separate planning, no more incompatible equipment, no more pretending they were 4 different armies. One force, one standard, one mission. In November 1980, a Navy SEAL officer named Richard Marcinko was given an extraordinary task: build a dedicated maritime counterterrorism unit from scratch. He named it SEAL Team 6. At the time, only 2 SEAL teams actually existed. The name was deliberate. It was psychological warfare designed to make Soviet intelligence believe America had 3 additional SEAL teams they had not been able to locate. SEAL Team 6 was placed under the JSOC umbrella. 3 decades later, it was the unit that put 2 bullets into Osama bin Laden's skull in a compound in Pakistan. In October 1981, the Army activated the 160th Aviation Battalion at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They were called the Night Stalkers, and they existed for one reason that was seared into every planner's mind by Desert One. Special Operations could not keep borrowing fleet pilots who were trained for completely different missions. They needed pilots who flew nothing else, trained for nothing else, and answered only to the Special Operations community. The 160th standard for hitting a target insertion point is plus or minus 30 seconds. Not minutes, seconds. The difference between those 2 numbers is often the difference between a mission succeeding and another Desert One. Then came the legislation that rewired the entire Department of Defense from the ground up. In October 1986, Congress passed the Goldwater-Nichols Act. This is the single most important piece of military legislation in modern American history. It forced the 4 services to operate jointly by law. It created one clear, unbroken chain of command from the president all the way down to the operator on the ground. It ended, by force of federal law, the rival company model that had killed 8 men in the Iranian desert. And in 1987, the Nunn-Cohen Amendment created United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, a 4-star unified command headquartered at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. SOCOM owned every Tier 1 Special Operations unit in every service: Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the 75th Rangers, the Green Berets, Air Force Special Tactics, the 160th Night Stalkers, all under one roof. One budget, one command, one purpose, and then the machine went to work. It did not just work. It became the most effective military instrument ever assembled by any nation in the history of warfare. October 2001. Afghanistan. 12-man Green Beret teams from the 5th Special Forces Group rode into combat on horseback. They used horses borrowed from local Afghan warlords because the terrain was too rugged for any vehicle. From horseback, using satellite communications, they called in B-52 airstrikes that hammered Taliban positions into rubble. In approximately 2 months, with a total ground force of just 400 to 500 American operators, they toppled the entire Taliban government. There's a 16-foot bronze statue of a horse soldier at Ground Zero in New York City. It stands there as a reminder of what those men did. December 2003. Iraq. After 9 months of relentless pursuit across an entire country, JSOC operators following intelligence built through the systematic interrogation of Saddam Hussein's inner circle found him hiding in a 6-foot spider hole beneath a mud-walled farmhouse near Tikrit. He was pulled out of the ground on camera, blinking in the light, by men in beards and Oakley sunglasses. The most powerful dictator in the Middle East, dragged into the world like a common fugitive. May 2nd, 2011, Abbottabad, Pakistan. 2 stealth-modified MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters from the 160th Night Stalkers carried 25 members of SEAL Team 6 and a Belgian Malinois named Cairo across 150 miles of Pakistani airspace. They flew at low altitude. They were never detected. Pakistan's radar never saw them. They were on the ground and gone before anyone in Islamabad even understood what had happened. Osama bin Laden, the architect of the September 11 attacks, the most wanted man on the planet, was dead. He was buried at sea within 24 hours. And then there is the mission that most people still do not fully understand. American Special Operations Forces flew into Venezuela at 2 in the morning. F-35 fighters neutralized Venezuelan air defenses before anyone knew the strike was underway. Delta operators hit Nicolas Maduro's compound, breached it, and removed the sitting president from his own bedroom, alive. The most protected man in the Western Hemisphere, in the middle of his own capital city, surrounded by his own military and his own intelligence services, extracted like he was not even there. Delta Force walked into the bedroom of a president and took him away. And by the next afternoon, he was on American soil facing narco-terrorism charges. That is what 45 years of uninterrupted operational evolution looks like when it is driven by one single unforgettable lesson. Now think about what Iran is facing today. The regime that celebrated the disaster at Desert One as proof that God was on its side is now staring down the machine that Desert One created. The sandstorm that Khomeini called divine protection, the burning helicopter that killed 8 Americans, the classified documents that Iranian intelligence spent years exploiting, the CIA asset names that ended careers and endangered lives. Every single one of those failures lit the fire that forged JSOC, SEAL Team 6, the Night Stalkers, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, SOCOM, and every single operation that followed. Iran did not mean to build this. Khomeini was not trying to give America the motivation to create the most lethal special operations force in human history. But that is exactly what happened. The humiliation was so total, so public, so undeniable that the United States had no choice but to tear down everything that had failed and rebuild it from the foundation up. And what rose from those ashes is now the most experienced, most capable, most surgically precise military machine ever deployed on Earth. Iran handed America the worst night in modern military history, and America used that night to construct something that has never failed to accomplish its objective. 45 years of continuous operational experience. Every lesson from every previous mission folded into the doctrine for the next one. The best intelligence architecture ever assembled, the best pilots in the world, the best door kickers ever put on this planet, and a singular institutional memory that never forgets, never forgives, and never stops improving. The regime that partied in the streets when those helicopters burned is now facing the consequence of that celebration. The machine that Desert One built is focused entirely on what Iran has become. And that machine does not fail. This is not a story about a disaster. This is a story about what disaster creates when the most powerful nation on Earth decides it will never be humiliated again. Every name I mentioned tonight, every operation, every unit, every piece of legislation, they all trace back to one salt flat in the Iranian desert where 8 men died and everything else was born. Iran thought that night was proof that God protected them. They were wrong. That night was the beginning of the end. It just took 45 years for the bill to arrive. And when it does, there will be no sandstorm in the world strong enough to stop what is coming.